Darling, your taste has always been questionable, but this is a new low even for you.
I figured the alumni mixer would be a couple of hours of forced nostalgia and lukewarm drinks before I could escape. I was incredibly naive. The moment my ex-wife took center stage flashing that practiced grin to announce what a failure of a man and father I was, the laughter didn't just ripple, it crushed me. I didn't defend myself, not because she was right, but because making a scene felt beneath me. That's when the atmosphere shifted. A woman stepped out of the crowd, slid her arm through mine, and purred, "Honey." Just like that, the power dynamic disintegrated. That cream-colored card had been sitting on my desk for 3 weeks mocking me. It was destined for the trash. University felt like a hazy, distant memory. I had no interest in resurrecting, but my daughter spotted the card on the counter. At 9 years old, Emma treats my history like an archaeological dig. I gave her a non-committal shrug. She insisted I needed a life outside of work. The kid had a point. My existence had calcified into a rigid schedule. Up at 6 in the morning, scrambled eggs, school drop-off, office grind, until 5, retrieval, algebra, help, dinner, sleep. Saturdays and Sundays were just a blur of grocery aisles and shin guards. Honest work, sure, but post-divorce, that regimented lifestyle was the only thing holding my sanity together. Structure prevents the collapse. Staring at the embossed lettering that morning, I realized Emma was onto something. Maybe I was due for a shakeup. I managed the chaotic calendar of Cole Enterprises as a senior executive assistant. It's not a flash career, but the check clears and the clock is steady. Vivian Cole. The woman at the helm operates with a terrifying efficiency that borders on the robotic. She sits on a billion-dollar empire, yet treats the janitor with the same directness as the board members. No fluff, just business. 4 years in her orbit, and she knows my rhythm specifically that my desk is empty at 5 o'clock sharp. She respects the boundary. However, the Friday before the event, she summoned me to the inner sanctum. We were reviewing the quarterly timeline when I flagged my early departure for the alumni gathering. Her eyes flicked up from the screen, assessing the value of the event. I downplayed it immediately. She barely paused before returning to her email. Almost as an afterthought, she noted she had a merger dinner at the exact same venue that night. "If you find yourself in a bind," she said, "call me." I took it as standard corporate politeness and walked out. Saturday arrived with unwanted speed. I deposited Emma with my sister and headed toward the downtown district. The venue was one of those refurbished industrial landmarks heavy on the exposed brick and polished brass. I navigated the marble lobby following the placards until I hit the ballroom. The crowd was already dense. Social circles had formed, clutching flutes of cheap champagne. A few faces triggered memories, though time had been kinder to some than others. Secure a beverage. Find a dark corner, wait it out. That was the strategy. Just an hour of visibility, then a quick exit. But fate had other ideas. Lauren held court in the middle of the floor, a queen bee surrounded by her loyal drones from the dorms. She hadn't aged a day. That signature blonde blowout and the predatory grin were perfectly intact. She was performing hands flying as she spoke. The group erupted in laughter at her punchline. It had been 6 years since we spoke, and the silence between us was vast. We were the college sweethearts who checked all the boxes, degree, marriage, starter, home. Then parenthood hit. She wanted the corner office. I wanted to raise the child. The friction turned into wars over finances and status until the silence became louder than the shouting. A signature on a settlement document, and she vanished to the coast while I stayed behind to braid hair and pack lunches. My plan to hug the wall and vanish failed. The room wasn't large enough to hide in. Lauren's radar was always impeccable. She pivoted, locked eyes with me, and paused. Then came the smile. It wasn't a greeting. It was an assessment of prey. She knew exactly how this would play out. She marched over her entourage in tow. I stiffened my spine and took a defensive sip of whiskey. She halted just inside my personal space, tilting her head as if studying a mediocre painting. Her audience waited. Jessica, a mutual friend from the old days, offered a sympathetic grimace. I returned it. But Lauren owned the floor. "Well, look who decided to show up," she chirped. I mumbled a dry greeting. She didn't miss a beat. "Still in that little 2-bedroom?" I confirmed it. She spun to her friend's voice, projected for the cheap seats. "He's allergic to ambition. Still stuck in the same spot I left him." She framed my stability as a pathology. Jessica looked at her shoes. Another friend, Claire, suddenly found the bottom of her glass fascinating. I refused to give Lauren the reaction she wanted. I refused to give Lauren the satisfaction of seeing me bleed. When she asked about Emma, I kept it brief. Thriving. That was all she needed to know. Lauren offered a slow, sympathetic nod, remarking that raising a child solo must be grueling. I said, "We get by." Her smile returned tight and pitying as she assured me she knew I was trying my hardest. The sentiment hovered between us, wrapped in sugar but tasting distinctly like venom. Jessica sensed the friction and pivoted to careers, asking what I did for a living. I told her I was handling administration as a senior secretary at a downtown firm. Lauren cut me off before I could finish. She announced to the circle that I had always flourished in support roles, happier fading into the wallpaper than leading the charge. Claire let out a jittery laugh. Amy, standing nearby, just arched a brow, keeping her thoughts to herself. The atmosphere curdled. We weren't just catching up. Lauren was laying the groundwork for a public execution. My instinct was to bail, but fleeing would only validate her narrative. So I planted my feet and braced for impact. She took a languid sip of her wine, eyeing me over the rim, and asked if I was seeing anyone. I gave a flat negative. She nodded as if my solitude was a foregone conclusion. Turning to her audience, she mused aloud that dating must be a struggle for me, considering I never quite grasped the concept of being an equal partner. A heavy silence smothered the group. Jessica suddenly found the contents of her drink fascinating. Claire shot Lauren a confused look, unsure of the endgame, while Amy physically recoiled. My molars ground together, but I forced my tone to remain level. I asked her to clarify. She gave a dismissive shrug, claiming I had a talent for dodging accountability rather than owning it. A decent guy, perhaps, but a failure as a husband and a father. The accusation hit with the weight of a sledgehammer. Heads turned in our direction. I saw the glint in Lauren's eyes. She was baiting me, begging me to explode and prove her point. Defend myself, I look guilty. Attack her, I look aggressive. It was a rigorous checkmate. I chose the only option left on the board, total silence. Naturally, she interpreted my lack of response as an admission of guilt. She pivoted back to her clique, a soft, pitiful chuckle escaping her lips, shaking her head as if second-hand embarrassment was overwhelming her. Jessica looked like she wanted to vanish. Claire mumbled an excuse about an empty glass, but Amy remained studying me like a specimen, under glass, part pity, part intrigue. Lauren continued her tone breezy and conversational, while every syllable sliced deeper. She claimed I was a master of the victim narrative, manipulating sympathy to mask my incompetence without ever actually stepping up. A fire ignited in my chest, threatening to spill over, but I suffocated it. I reminded myself their opinions were worthless. They were strangers to my reality. They didn't see the mornings I dragged myself out of bed to ensure Emma had everything, the showing up, the staying, when I wanted to run. Yet, standing there, surrounded by eyes that viewed me as a walking cautionary tale, my internal pep talk began to sound hollow. Lauren, however, had not finished her meal. She flashed that razor-blade smile, expressing a hope that my parenting skills exceeded my abysmal performance as a husband. For Emma's sake, she added. The floor felt unsteady. My mouth opened, desperate to launch a counterattack. The words died in my throat. Any denial would just sound like a desperate alibi. Nothing I said could rewrite the script she had sold them. I made the hard call. I held my tongue. I scanned their faces, Lauren, her entourage, and offered them nothing. Jessica shifted her weight, practically climbing out of her skin. Claire had fully disengaged. Amy wore a frown, but Lauren stood tall, basking in the glow of her petty victory. She had won the prize, publicly dismantling me in front of our old circle, and I had handed her the hammer. I was preparing my retreat when the air shifted. A warmth, sudden and steady, pressed against my side. A slender arm looped through mine, anchoring itself at my elbow. I turned bewildered to find the source. Vivian Cole. My boss. She stood there in an immaculate black dress, face an unreadable mask. She met my gaze with surprising softness before turning that icy composure onto Lauren. Then she spoke. Honey. The single word shattered the tension like a brick through a plate glass window. Time froze. I stared at Vivian, my mind racing to reconcile the woman signing my paychecks with the woman holding my arm. She leaned into me, possessing the space as if she belonged there, her grip conveying a practiced, effortless intimacy. She looked bored, frankly, as if walking into a nest of vipers was just another Tuesday. But this was an anomaly. Vivian Cole didn't do random hotel mixers. She didn't use terms of endearment with subordinates, and she certainly didn't dirty her hands with domestic skirmishes. Lauren's smirk faltered, a glitch in the matrix. Her eyes darted between me and the powerhouse on my arm, the calculations running visibly in her head. Jessica's jaw went slack. Claire whipped back around, abandoning all pretense of politeness to stare. Amy looked like she was witnessing a pileup on the freeway. The silence grew heavy, suffocating. I could feel my heart hammering against my windpipe. Vivian's voice cut through the tension like polished glass, smooth, cool, and commanding. I hope I'm not crashing anything crucial. Lauren didn't miss a beat, snapping her plastic smile back into place. Hardly, she chirped, just reminiscing with old acquaintances. Vivian turned to me, her gaze holding a warmth that never existed within the office walls. Ready to make an exit? She asked. My brain short-circuited. All I could manage was a stiff nod. Lauren wasn't about to relinquish the spotlight. She thrust a hand toward Vivian, staking her territory. She enunciated every syllable of her name, testing the waters. Vivian took the hand with a professional detachment that offered zero emotional traction. And how exactly do you two connect? Lauren probed. I felt Vivian's hand on my arm give a reassuring squeeze. Colleagues, Vivian replied simply. Lauren's brow arched. Doing what? I run a firm. Which one? Cole Enterprises. The syllables landed with the weight of a gavel strike. You could practically see the gears grinding in Lauren's head as the realization hit. In this city, that name was royalty. It was a corporate giant. Vivian Cole wasn't just my manager, she was sitting on a fortune that eclipsed everyone else in the room combined. Jessica looked ready to faint. Claire's expression soured as if she'd bitten into a lemon. Amy exhaled a sound halfway between a gasp and a chuckle. Lauren scrambled for footing, eventually forcing out, impressive. Vivian offered a detached nod. Lauren pivoted back to me, her grin straining at the edges now. So how long have you two been involved? My voice died in my throat. Vivian stepped in. Quite some time. Long enough to understand his character. Long enough to know the man. Lauren's mask slipped. The arrogance she'd worn like armor all evening developed a hairline fracture. Meaning, she challenged. Vivian remained maddeningly calm. He is solid. He shows up when the chips are down. I have watched him bypass career jumps and overtime pay simply to be present for his daughter. Selflessness is a rare currency and he is rich in it. Lauren's smile vanished completely. Jessica suddenly found her shoes fascinating. Claire hid behind her wineglass, refusing to look up. Amy studied Vivian like a biological specimen. I stood there paralyzed, trying to process the defense. It wasn't just a defense, it was a deposition. Vivian delivered facts with such absolute certainty that they became the only reality in the room. Lauren clawed for control. Quaint that you think so highly of him, she sneered. But reliability wasn't always his strong suit. Vivian cocked her head, offering a look of polite curiosity rather than anger. Do tell. Lauren unleashed the script. I was commitment-phobic selfish, a man who prioritized his own comfort over sacrifice, leaving her to shoulder the marital burden solo. Vivian let her run out of steam. No interruptions, no arguments, no defensiveness either. She just held a long, heavy gaze on Lauren before shifting her eyes to mine. Perception is often a mirror of desire, she mused. History is easily edited when you silence the opposition. I know he has flaws, but he possesses a terrifying amount of honesty. That is a commodity most people undervalue. Color flooded Lauren's cheeks. You don't know the half of it. True, Vivian conceded. I don't know the whole story, but I know the data points that matter. I see a man who clocks in early. A man who balances sick days for his child with unpaid late nights to settle the ledger. He refused a title bump because it cost him weekends at home. She paused for effect. Those are the metrics I choose to track. The room went dead silent. Jessica looked ready to bolt. Claire studied the carpet patterns. Amy's gaze had hardened into grudging respect. Lauren stood rigid, jaw-clenched, scanning her mental archives for a retort. She fired one last volley. Office politics aren't domestic life, she argued. You can't judge a soul by a spreadsheet. Vivian nodded slowly. Perhaps, but in my experience liars don't change their stripes when they cross a threshold. And consistency in the small things usually predicts consistency in the big ones. The blood drained from Lauren's face. She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut. Vivian looked on with a pity that stung worse than anger. I am not here to litigate your history. That is outside my jurisdiction. I simply wanted to ensure he knows his value isn't defined by your narrative. Some of us appreciate the effort he brings to the table, and he certainly doesn't need to stand trial before a judge who has already written the verdict. Vivian's words landed with the finality of a gavel verdict, silencing the room more effectively than any defense I could have mustered. Lauren's gaze darted frantically from me to Vivian, then back to her clique, desperate for an escape route. The squad's unity crumbled instantly. Jessica muttered a flimsy excuse about the ladies' room, while Claire suddenly found the bottom of her wine glass fascinating and bolted for a refill. Even Amy, usually the loyalist, wavered before abandoning ship. In a heartbeat, Lauren was stranded on her own little island that practiced socialite grin, wiped clean, replaced by the rigid posture of someone losing control. Stripped of her audience, she seemed to physically shrink, the grandeur fading. Vivian pivoted to me, repeating her question about my departure, and the lump in my throat finally dissolved enough for me to speak. "Absolutely," I managed. With a curt nod, she steered us toward the doors, keeping her arm woven through mine like a protective shield against the room's judgment. We cut through the crowd, leaving a wake of hushed gossip and side-eyes. Snips of speculation drifted our way like static from a bad radio signal. "Is that actually Vivian Cole?" one voice hissed. Another murmured surprise, wondering when I'd managed to land someone so clearly out of my league. A third observer decided my quiet nature must have been a cover for a secret high-rolling lifestyle all along. The heavy double doors swung shut, muffling the ballroom's pretension into a dull thrum. Only then did Vivian release me, squaring her shoulders to look me in the eye. The fierce defender vanished, replaced by the inscrutable executive I reported to every day. "Are you all right?" she inquired, her tone cool and clinical. Answering felt impossible, so I deflected. "What are you even doing here?" I stammered. She merely raised an eyebrow, reminding me of the client dinner she'd flagged on her calendar that morning. Apparently, her meeting had wrapped up, and while passing the venue, she'd spotted me through the open archway like a deer in headlights. She'd sensed the ambush immediately. But why? I pressed, desperate to understand. Why stage that scene? Why pretend? Why go to bat for me against total strangers? Vivian held my gaze, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't acting," she stated simply. She ticked off the facts, my competence in the office, my devotion to my daughter. She insisted that petty tyrants like Lauren only wield influence when we consent to be ruled by them. "I despise intimidation tactics," she added, "and I have zero tolerance for seeing decent men dismantled for sport." I was floored. In 4 years under her command, she'd been a model of civility, never cruel, but never once crossing the line into familiarity. She was the architect of efficiency and distance. But this was a breach of protocol. This was intimate. "Aren't you concerned about the optics?" I asked. The CEO swooping in to rescue a subordinate from his ex-wife's drama. Vivian gave a dismissive shrug, the gesture of someone who owns the building, not just the room. The gallery always chatters. I stopped letting the opinions of irrelevant people dictate my actions decades ago. We lingered there, the silence of the corridor wrapping around us. The bass from the party thumped faintly against the walls a world away. "Do you intend to return to the fray?" she asked. "Not a chance," I replied. "Wise choice," she agreed. "Take Monday. Don't come in. You look like a man who needs 24 hours to reset." My protest died in my throat as she raised a palm to silence me. "That's an order, not a request. You're sitting on a mountain of unused leave, burn some of it." I acquiesced with a nod. She pivoted on her heel, took a step, and then paused. Looking back, she offered a final piece of wisdom. "Don't mistake your silence for cowardice. Sometimes denying unworthy people access to your energy is the ultimate power move." However, she softened slightly, stoicism has its limits. There are those who would value your voice should you choose to use it. She left the subject of that statement ambiguous. With that, she departed, the sharp staccato of her heels fading down the hall. I remained rooted to the spot, trying to solve the puzzle she'd just handed me. Lauren had attempted a public execution of my character before an audience of ghosts from my past. Then, my employer materialized like a deus ex machina, rewriting the script entirely. Now, alone in the corridor, I was torn between profound gratitude and utter embarrassment. A messy cocktail of both likely. I checked my screen. It was barely 8. Chateau. 30. The night was young. I could re-enter the lion's den and endure the interrogation, or I could clock out, grab Emma early, and invest my time in something real. It wasn't even a contest. I headed for the glass doors. Glancing through the ballroom archway one last time, I spotted Lauren near the bar holding court with a stranger. She was performing again, laughed too loud. Gestures too wide, desperately plastering over the cracks in her composure to prove she was still the queen bee. Her entourage, Jessica, Claire, and Amy, had migrated across the floor, clustered in a tight circle dissecting the drama. A few bystanders caught my eye and immediately found interest in their shoes. I pushed through the lobby and let the cool evening air hit my face. My sedan was a 2-block hike away, and I welcomed the distance. I took my time letting the adrenaline dissipate. Vivian's lecture on silence replayed in my mind the idea that refusal to engage is a form of armor, not surrender. I'd wasted the night walking on eggshells, terrified of creating a scene. Perhaps that was prudent, but God, it was draining to be that small. My thoughts drifted to Emma. To her, I was a giant. The quiet sacrifices I made, the very ones Lauren twisted into evidence of my failure, were the foundation of my daughter's world. My life felt modest, maybe even invisible, until an outsider shone a spotlight on its worth. Vivian saw the dignity in the grind. She'd fought a battle I was too polite to wage, and while the implications were murky, the feeling of validation was crystal clear. For the first time in ages, the feeling of being just part of the wallpaper faded. I actually felt seen. I slid into the driver's seat, but didn't turn the key, just letting the silence of the car wash over me. The ghost of Vivian's arm still felt heavy against mine. I kept picturing that look she gave Lauren, cool, aristocratic, completely untouchable. She spoke as if I had value, as if I wasn't just some guy scraping by. Whether I earned that protection is debatable, but God, I needed it. Finally, I cranked the engine and merged into traffic, watching the street lamps smear into streaks of light on the way to my sister's place. My mind raced with scripts for Emma. Do I mention the reunion? Her mother. The woman who stood up for me. Better to keep it vague. I survived, and I'm happy to be back in our little bubble. I got there at 9:45. My sister answered the door with that squinty, analyzing look, sensing the drama clinging to my jacket, but wise enough not to pry. Then Emma barreled down the hall, backpack thumping against her spine with every step. Was it fun? She chirped. I went with interesting, which immediately triggered her suspicious side. Define interesting, she pressed. Later, I dodged. The ride home became a monologue about some movie she'd caught with her cousin. Talking animals, bright colors, I threw in a wow, or really, on cue, but I was miles away. My brain was stuck on a loop, Vivian crossing the room, the deliberate way she claimed my arm. Lauren's smugness crumbling the whole room's atmosphere, pivoting on a dime. Darling, it felt like a hallucination. You okay, Dad? I caught her eyes in the rear view, wearing that heavy, worried look no kid should have to master. I lied. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't buying it. I forced myself to snap back to reality. She didn't need to haul my baggage around. Once we were through the door, we shifted into the bedtime routine. While she scrubbed her teeth and wrestled into pajamas, I straightened up the clutter in the living room. It was nearly 11 o'clock by the time she was under the covers, but she hadn't forgotten. So the reunion, she whispered. Perched on the edge of her mattress, I curated the edit, saw some old faces, had a decent chat. Nothing crazy. Did you see Mom? The yes hung in the air. Emma's expression froze, shutting down any further interrogation. She just stared at me with eyes far too ancient for a 9-year-old. It was okay, Em, I promised. Brief chat, then I bailed. Then came the big one. Did she ask about me? I gave her the truth. Her mother had in fact asked how she was. A slow nod, and she retreated beneath the quilt, pulling it right up to her chin. I'm glad you went, she mumbled. You need a life outside of work and me. I kissed her forehead, telling her I loved her more than anything. She echoed the sentiment and drifted off. I stepped into the hall, letting the silence of the empty apartment wash over me. It was suffocatingly quiet. I headed to the kitchen to brew coffee I definitely didn't need. Despite the hour, I slumped at the table, staring at the drywall and dissecting the evening. One question kept circling: why Vivian? She owed me zero. Our dynamic was strictly 9 to 5, polite, functional, and miles apart socially. Before tonight, she'd never given a damn about my existence outside of whether I clocked in on time. But that look she leveled at Lauren, it wasn't heated. It was the calm authority of someone who knows my worth and doesn't need to check with the gallery. She listed my traits: showing up, making sacrifices, being honest, like they were rare virtues, not just the bare minimum of survival. Yet coming from her, those basics sounded like gold. Monday rolled around, and I actually took the day off per Vivian's orders. I burned the morning scrubbing the floors and running loads of wash. With Emma at school, the quiet hit differently. It wasn't lonely, it felt settled. I tossed together some lunch and surfed the cable channels aimlessly until my phone vibrated against the cushion. Unknown number. Turned out to be Jessica, claiming she pulled my digits from the alumni directory. She was offering a mea culpa for Saturday. I stared at the screen for a solid minute, debating whether to engage. I typed back a generic, "no worries." She responded immediately with a wall of text. Apparently, Lauren had been trashing me for weeks, scripting this confrontation. Jessica and the clique tried to talk her down, but Lauren was on a warpath. Jessica felt like garbage for staying silent, admitting Vivian nailed it and that I didn't deserve the public flogging. I had no vocabulary for that level of pity. I tapped out a thanks and tossed the phone aside. So Lauren had premeditated the ambush, rehearsing her little monologue to maximize the humiliation in front of our high school ghosts. Oddly, it tracked. She always needed the final victory. The divorce happened too fast for her to twist the knife properly, so she staged this little play to write her own ending, a narrative where she controlled the spin. I clocked back in on Tuesday while Vivian spent the hours sequestered in high-level strategy sessions behind closed doors. Our paths didn't cross until the late shift when she drifted by my cubicle to offload a stack of dossiers. She inquired about my personal time, a polite formality. I gave the standard affirmative. She offered a curt nod, pivoted to leave, then paused. "Any more alumni gatherings on your calendar?" she asked. I told her I'd likely retire from that circuit. "Wise choice," she murmured. A faint, barely there smile touched her lips before she retreated into her executive suite. End of scene. No debriefing, no emotional autopsy of the weekend's chaos. Just a transaction, then. You return to the status quo. I suppose that's the executive operating system. Execute the necessary maneuver, then advance. She didn't trade in applause or debts of gratitude, only results and forward motion. The work week dissolved into the usual gray rhythm. The grind, my daughter, the apartment. Yet the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thinner, easier to breathe, as if an invisible yoke had been unhitched from my shoulders. Her hallway philosophy lingered in my head. The idea that keeping your mouth shut isn't always a sign of submission. Sometimes silence is armor. There's no utility in pleading your case to a jury that's already written the verdict. She had a point. For years, I'd been fighting to disprove Lauren's caricature of me, exhausting myself to demonstrate that I was scraping by, that I possessed value. But the evidence was already clear to the constituency that actually counted. My daughter, my boss, my sister, they saw the reality. Everything else was static. Friday morning, summoned to the corner office, Vivian briefed me on an upcoming initiative requiring boots on the ground elsewhere. Standard procedure. A short hop to a satellite city for client acquisition. She queried if I could handle the logistical orchestration. I agreed immediately. She asked about my childcare constraints. I assured her my sister was on standby for Emma. A nod of approval for my adaptability. Then she deviated from the script. She explicitly stated that my labor had value, citing me as a cornerstone of the department's reliability. She wanted that on the record. I offered gratitude. She dismissed it with a hand-wave, eyes already returning to the screen. I walked back to my station carrying a rare sentiment. Visibility. Not the spotlight, just the quiet confirmation of existence. Credit for the invisible grind. Minor in the grand scheme, but monumental to me. By Saturday, I was back in dad mode at the playground. Emma claimed the swing set while I held down a bench. Sunlight, warm breeze, the textbook definition of a weekend respite. She demanded altitude. I took my post behind the rubber seat, starting with gentle shoves that graduated to forceful launches as she shrieked and pumped her legs. Mid-arc, she asked about my happiness levels. I confirmed they were high. When pressed for a reason, I told her proximity to her was the cause. She grinned, reclining into the momentum, letting gravity and physics take the wheel. I watched her cut through the atmosphere, hair trailing like a comet's tail face alight. The week's events washed over me again. The cocktail party skirmish, the insults, the executive bailout, and the silence that followed. The dawning comprehension that dignity isn't something you petition for, it's factory installed. I just had to stop letting the Laurens of the world appraise my worth. I surveyed the architecture of my life. Modest, utilitarian, heavy on duty, and light on glamour, but structurally sound and punctuated by these peaks. Her laughter, our solidarity. The quiet nobility of punching the clock and handling business day in and day out. Sufficiency. It had always been adequate. The calendar rolled over to Monday, and I reported for duty. Vivian was already entrenched behind her glass walls, fingers flying across the keyboard. I delivered caffeine and the quarterly metrics. She muttered a thank you, eyes glued to the data. Equilibrium restored. Professional, remote, machine-like. But I'd decoded the silence. The distance wasn't apathy. Her observational skills went deeper than the spreadsheet. She had deployed her influence when I was under fire, then withdrew to her perimeter once the threat was neutralized. Whether this shifted the tectonic plates of our professional relationship remained to be seen. We'd likely never discuss that night again. I made peace with that. Not every interaction requires a post-mortem. The optics were clear enough she stood on my side of the line when the chips were down. She voiced the defense I couldn't afford to make, then granted me the grace to move forward. I settled into my chair and fired up the inbox. The shift sprawled out before me, a landscape of deadlines and the 1,000 microscopic administrative duties that justified my paycheck. Lauren was likely back in her high-rise world, spinning her own revisionist history. The reunion crowd had dispersed, the awkward theater of that night fading from memory. Emma was secure in her classroom, banking on the certainty that I'd be at the gate at 3 o'clock. And I was present. Not the failure Lauren described, not the shadow I feared I was casting. Just the reality single father, loyal worker, the guy who shows up, the guy who makes the effort. A man who learned that integrity doesn't require a defense attorney when it's demonstrated in the daily grind. The truth has buoyancy. It surfaces eventually. And the observers who matter will always recognize the real thing. Everything else just faded into white noise. I began hammering the keys. It was grunt work, far removed from the luxury of the executive suite, but it was the one thing I actually controlled.